Diane Cooper pushed open the front door with the weight of someone who had carried not only the burdens of her workday, but also years of unspoken fatigue. The late evening air of Wichita still clung to her jacket, warm and stale, but inside the house it was worse, a suffocating mess that greeted her like an unwanted guest. The kitchen was the first thing she saw. The table, once neatly set in the mornings, was buried under dirty plates crusted with food, greasy cups, and the stench of ketchup spilled and never wiped. Cigarette butts lay scattered across the surface, and a sticky puddle had spread across the floor, dark and tacky beneath the fluorescent light. An overturned mug with a dried ring of coffee lay on its side, like a mute witness to the chaos. Diane stood in the doorway, her body aching from the hour-long bus ride after her shift, the cramped seat still imprinted on her back. She had cleaned this kitchen before leaving in the morning, wiped the counters, put away last night's dinner, made sure everything was ready for the day. She had even prepared food for Robert, her husband, who didn't leave for work until 10, and for Hannah, their 22-year-old daughter, whose shift at the grocery store wasn't until the afternoon. Yet nothing had changed. No, everything had changed, but for the worse. The sight of it all broke something inside her. She dropped her purse onto a chair already cluttered with laundry and lowered herself heavily onto another, the edge of the seat biting into her legs. Her hands trembled as she buried her face into them. Tears slipped through her fingers, falling onto the dirty tabletop. She wasn't crying just because the house was a wreck. She cried because she had a husband and a daughter, yet lived as if she were completely alone. The thought was bitter, sharp as glass. Nobody in this house saw her exhaustion. Nobody asked if she was well, if her back ached from lifting heavy grocery bags, or if her spirit felt hollow from endless routine. To them, she was a machine, one that cooked, scrubbed, washed, folded, and made sure the household ran like clockwork. Robert still called himself the breadwinner, as if that excused everything. But what did his paycheck mean when he couldn't so much as carry a grocery bag or wash a plate? He could name every brand of beer in the store, but not the last time he had asked his wife how she was feeling. And Hannah, her only daughter, grown and old enough to know better, acted as if adulthood meant freedom from any responsibility. She worked part-time at the register, yet never contributed a dime to the household. She bought cosmetics, clothes, gadgets, and left the bills for her parents. Worse than the money was her disdain. Hannah didn't cook, didn't clean, didn't even put her dirty laundry into the basket. Diane's tears came harder, her chest tightening as though grief itself were strangling her. The mess around her was only a mirror of her life. She had long stopped hoping that Robert or Hannah would lend a hand. What hurt wasn't the labor, it was the invisibility. They treated her as if she were second class, a servant in her own home. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her skin. Her eyes moved from the table to the living room, where clothes were scattered across the floor, socks and shirts tossed carelessly. Even the bedroom wasn't spared. Their marital bed had become just another battlefield of untidiness, sheets tangled and unwashed. In Hannah's room, underwear was strewn across the carpet, the closet doors left open with piles of clothes spilling out like a storm. The house was loud in its silence. Robert would be home soon, grumbling about dinner, leaving his shoes in the hallway, flipping on the TV before saying a word to her. Hannah would breeze through, earbuds in, phone glowing, never noticing her mother's swollen eyes. For a moment, Diane let her head rest on the edge of the table, her tears soaking into a napkin that should have been thrown away days ago. She thought of all the years she had poured into this home, into this family, and wondered how it had come to this, a woman with a husband and daughter, yet lonelier than she had ever been. In that kitchen, surrounded by the filth of other people's disregard, Diane Cooper felt the crushing weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. She wasn't living, she was surviving, and in that moment her tears were not just from exhaustion, but from the dawning realization that something had to change, though she had no idea yet how or when. Diane lifted her head from the table and let her gaze fall unfocused on the clutter around her. In the stillness, her mind drifted back, unbidden, to the days when life felt full of promise, when Robert had been more than just another burden on her shoulders. She remembered the first time they met. It was at a campus party during their junior year at Wichita State. The air had smelled of cheap beer and pizza, and the music was too loud, but Robert's laugh had cut through the noise. Back then, he was tall, easygoing, quick with a joke. She had come with a friend, and he with another girl. Yet somehow they had ended up talking in the corner about classes, about favorite movies, about where they saw themselves after graduation. He had seemed so interested, so engaged. By the second party, they arrived separately but left together. Long walks across campus at night became their ritual. They would stop for late-night coffee, argue over which professor was the toughest, share secrets about family and dreams. Robert was attentive then, quick to reach for her hand, eager to listen. She had fallen for the way he made her laugh, the way he carried himself like someone who would always step up when needed. Their wedding came just a year later, a modest ceremony, but filled with joy. They were young, poor, and optimistic. Robert had started working at a local auto shop while Diane finished her degree. When Hannah was born not long after, Diane left her classes behind, and Robert took on extra shifts. Back then, it felt like a partnership. He would run to the grocery store after work, sometimes surprising her with flowers tucked between the bread and milk. He washed dishes, even cooked the occasional stew, proud of how she praised his effort. They would bundle Hannah into the car seat and spend weekends at the zoo or eat ice cream in the park. But those golden years slipped away slowly, almost without her noticing. Robert grew tired of helping around the house. The excuses came one by one. That's not men's work. Or, you know better what groceries to buy. His hands that once helped with dishes now only reached for the remote or a cold bottle of beer. The laughter she had loved was replaced by grunts, complaints, and the hum of the television that never seemed to turn off. And Hannah, once a bright-eyed child eager to tag along on family outings, entered her teenage years like a storm. She dyed her hair in garish colors, pierced her nose, stayed out late with friends Diane didn't know. Arguments became daily battles. Diane pleaded with Robert to step in, to set boundaries, to guide their daughter. But he shrugged it off. You're the mother. You deal with it. I don't understand girls. The distance between husband and wife widened with every night Robert sat glued to his computer screen, headphones blocking out the world, while Hannah slammed doors and shouted about freedom. Diane stood in the middle of it all, invisible, her voice drowned out by their indifference. Those memories, so vivid in her mind, pressed down on her chest like a weight. She had once believed in the idea of family, of shared burdens and joys. But now the only thing left was the echo of what used to be, a partnership eroded into silence, a marriage hollowed out, a daughter who barely looked at her anymore. Sitting there in the messy kitchen, Diane felt the ache of those years more sharply than ever. The love that had once carried her was gone, replaced by the cold truth that she was nothing more than a servant in her own home, a shadow of the woman she used to be. The smell of fried meat still lingered in the air when Robert came home. He dropped his boots in the hallway without looking up and trudged straight into the kitchen, switching on the television in the living room as he passed. Diane had just finished setting plates on the table, her hands moving in automatic motions, tired but precise. Dinner ready yet? Robert muttered, cracking open a can of beer he'd brought with him. He didn't even wait for her answer before taking a long gulp, the sound of his swallowing louder than his words. Diane slid the plate toward him, pot roast potatoes, a loaf of bread cut unevenly in her haste. He looked down and frowned. Couldn't you have cooked it a little longer? Looks dry. She bit back a reply, lowering herself into her chair. Hannah walked in a moment later, phone in hand, screen glowing against her face. She sat down with a dramatic sigh, dropped her phone beside the plate, and stabbed at the meat with her fork. One bite, and she grimaced. Seriously, Mom? You never season this right. It's either bland or way too salty. Don't you taste it before you serve it. Diane's chest tightened. Her fork hovered above her own plate, appetite gone. She had spent her day on her feet at work, dragged groceries home in bags that cut into her palms, cooked the meal they were now tearing apart, and yet all she received were complaints. Robert chewed noisily, shaking his head. Maybe next time just make a stew. At least you can't ruin that. The words hit harder than he realized. Diane looked at both of them, her husband drinking beer like it was water, her daughter scrolling through her phone between bites, not once looking up to see her mother's face. A thought rose uninvited, sharp and frightening in its clarity. What if I weren't here? What would happen if one day I just disappeared? The silence inside her own head answered quickly. They wouldn't know how to manage. Robert would grumble, sure, but who would wash his clothes, put meals on the table, remind him of his doctor's appointments? And Hannah, she could barely take her own dishes to the sink, let alone run a household. Without Diane, the fragile rhythm of their lives would collapse in a matter of days. Yet neither of them seemed aware of that. They sat at the table as if she were invisible, their words cutting but casual, as though she were some service they were entitled to, not a human being with a heart that ached. Her eyes burned, but she forced herself not to cry, not in front of them. Instead, she gathered the plates once they were done, scraping half-eaten food into the trash. Hannah left the table without a word, her phone buzzing with a new notification. Robert leaned back in his chair, the television calling him louder than his wife's silence. Diane stood at the sink, staring at the dirty dishes piling higher, the water running but untouched. The roar of it filled her ears until all she could hear was her own voice inside. They don't see me. They don't care. I am nothing but a shadow in this house. She gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, and drew a shaky breath. A seed had been planted, small but undeniable. She didn't know when or how, but the thought of leaving, of breaking free from this cycle, had taken root. And as Robert barked from the living room, "Don't forget to bring me another beer," Diane knew with chilling certainty that the woman she used to be was slipping away, and the woman she needed to become was waiting, just beyond the walls of this suffocating house. The next morning Diane arrived at the office with the same heaviness she carried every day, clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee that did little to wake her. The building smelled faintly of printer toner and stale air conditioning, the kind of place where time seemed to blur into one long week. She slid into her cubicle, straightened a stack of files, and tried to focus, though her body still ached from last night's dinner table humiliation. Not long after, her supervisor, Mr. Andrews, appeared at the edge of her desk. He was a kind man in his way, gray at the temples, but today his eyes didn't meet hers. "Diane," he said quietly, "can you come into my office for a moment?" Her stomach dropped. She followed him down the narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the walls. Inside his office, he motioned for her to sit. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, but his hands fidgeted with a pen. "I'll be straightforward," he began, his voice low, almost apologetic. "The company's going through a rough patch. Budget cuts, payroll reductions. We're going to have to let some people go." Diane sat very still, watching the pen roll between his fingers. "I see," she said, her voice steady. He cleared his throat. "You've been here a long time. You've done good work. But we can't afford to keep everyone on at the same rate. If you were willing to write a resignation letter, make it official as voluntary, it would save the company from having to pay severance. In return, we'll make sure you get your full paycheck through today. No delays." The words hung in the air, heavy and yet strangely liberating. For years, she had carried the fear of losing her job. Now, faced with the reality, she felt something unexpected rising within her. Not panic, not shame, but a quiet sense of release. She straightened in her chair. "So if I write this letter today, you'll make sure my wages are paid in full. Through this afternoon." He nodded quickly. Yes, we'll process it right away. A small smile touched her lips. All right then. I'll draft it now. It took her only a few minutes. The words, "I resign," effective immediately, looked stark on the page, but she signed them without hesitation. When she handed the letter to Mr. Andrews, his relief was obvious. "Thank you, Diane." "I'm truly sorry," he said, almost whispering. She rose, shaking his hand gently. "Don't be. Maybe it's time for a change." An hour later, she walked out of the office building with an envelope in her bag. Her paycheck, every cent accounted for. The sun was bright against the glass windows, and for the first time in years, the weight pressing on her chest lifted. She stood on the sidewalk, cars rushing by, people hurrying to their own routines. She should have been terrified, unemployed, uncertain of the future. But instead, she felt light, as though a locked door had swung open. The job that had chained her to exhaustion was gone. The complaints at home would continue, yes, but now she saw it clearly. She didn't have to stay trapped. She had just been given proof that life could shift in an instant, that escape was possible. As Diane walked toward the bus stop, the Kansas wind tugging at her hair, she realized that what she carried in her bag wasn't just money, it was permission. Permission to imagine a different life. When Diane stepped back into the house that evening, the air was heavy with the same old staleness. The kitchen looked as though no one had touched it since she left that morning. Plates from breakfast sat stacked haphazardly in the sink, crumbs littered the counter, and an empty cereal box leaned against the wall. The living room bore its usual wounds. Socks flung onto the couch, Robert's jacket tossed over a chair, Hannah's sneakers abandoned in the middle of the floor. It was as if the day had been waiting for her return, waiting for her to put it all back together. But tonight, something in her had shifted. She didn't feel the usual pull to clean, to sigh and pick up after them. She stood still in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Quietly, she moved to the bedroom. She pulled out a duffel bag, the one they usually used for weekend trips that never seemed to happen anymore. Methodically, she folded a few changes of clothes, tucked in her toiletries her wallet, and a folder of documents. Birth certificate, social security card, marriage license. The bag wasn't heavy, but it felt momentous, as if each item she placed inside was a declaration. I matter and I am leaving. She sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, the mess of Robert's clothes scattered across the floor around her. She reached for a notepad on the nightstand, tore off a sheet, and wrote in steady block letters, I left. Don't wait. No explanations, no apologies. She folded the note once and left it on the kitchen table, right beside the half-empty ashtray. With the bag slung over her shoulder, she slipped out the door before anyone came home. The evening air wrapped around her like a secret. She walked briskly down the street toward the bus station, each step steadier than the last. Inside the terminal, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the rows of plastic chairs smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The schedule board flickered overhead, listing destinations across the Midwest. She scanned the names until one caught her eye, not because she knew it, but because she didn't. A town with a simple, almost tender name, somewhere far enough to feel like another world. She bought a one-way ticket with the envelope of money still fresh from her final paycheck. When the bus pulled up, she climbed aboard, settling into a seat near the window. The engine rumbled to life, and the city she had known for decades began to slide away, street by street. Diane pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching Wichita's lights blur into the darkness. There was no fear, only an odd exhilaration, as if she had slipped free of invisible chains. By the time dawn broke, the bus rolled into the small town. The streets were nearly empty, bathed in the pale gold of early morning. Storefronts were shuttered, sidewalks quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of dew and fresh earth. It was the kind of calm she had forgotten existed. She stepped down onto the pavement, duffel bag in hand, and drew in a long breath. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing to fix anyone's mess, wasn't hurrying to make herself useful. She was simply standing in a place where no one knew her name, no one expected her to serve. The weight on her shoulders lightened with the rising sun. Diane Cooper, for the first time in a long time, felt free. The bus station was only a few blocks from the center of town, and with the dawn still fresh, Diane walked slowly, her bag heavy on her shoulder, but her steps oddly light. She passed shuttered shops with old-fashioned signs, a bakery releasing the warm smell of bread into the morning air, and a narrow diner already lit inside. The streets were calm, the quiet broken only by the occasional car. For a moment, she felt like she had wandered into another life. She found a small roadside motel at the edge of town, the kind with faded paint and a neon sign that hummed even in daylight. The woman at the front desk barely looked up, sliding a key across the counter after Diane paid for 3 nights. The room was simple, 1 bed, a dresser, a lamp with a cracked shade, but to Diane it looked like luxury. The sheets were clean, the surfaces empty, the air unmarked by stale smoke or clutter. She set her bag down and stood there, absorbing the silence. After a quick shower, she changed into fresh clothes and decided not to waste the morning. She locked the door and strolled back into town. By then, the diner she had passed was bustling. She slid into a booth by the window, ordered coffee and pancakes, and let herself savor the moment. The syrup was too sweet, the coffee a little bitter, but it was perfect. She was eating not because someone else needed her to serve them, not because she had to hurry and clear the table, but simply because she wanted to. It felt like a vacation, her first in years. She lingered after breakfast, watching townspeople filter in. A group of construction workers laughing over eggs and bacon. A mother with a toddler. 2 older men discussing weather patterns like it was the most important news of the day. No one knew her here. No one demanded anything. She could just be. Her phone vibrated on the table, breaking the spell. The screen lit up, Robert. She flipped it face down. A minute later, Hannah. Then Robert again. The buzzing continued, relentless, as if the device itself were possessed. Finally, Diane opened the phone, scanning the string of messages. Where are you? Why didn't you make dinner? The house is a mess. Hannah's hungry. Come back right now. The tone wasn't worry, it was entitlement, like they had misplaced their maid. Another string arrived, this time from Hannah. Dad says you better stop this nonsense. I'm not cleaning up after you. You think you can just leave? I have to work today and I don't have clean clothes. Thanks a lot. Diane stared at the screen until her vision blurred. A laugh, bitter and sharp, escaped her throat. Not a single message, asked if she was safe. Not one wondered if she was okay. She took a breath, typed slowly and hit send. You're grown. Manage without me. Then she turned off the phone, slid it into her bag, and returned to her coffee. Outside the window, the morning sun had risen higher, casting long golden rays across the quiet street. Diane lifted her cup and drank, tasting the warmth, savoring the silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she wasn't bound to that house anymore. She was free, and freedom, even in the form of pancakes and black coffee in a nameless town, was the sweetest gift she'd ever given herself. For the first few days, Diane lived as if she were on borrowed time, savoring each hour like it was a delicacy she hadn't tasted in years. She walked the narrow streets of the town, pausing to admire storefronts with painted windows and flower boxes. She stepped into the local museum, its quiet halls filled with artifacts of prairie life, quilts and farming tools, photographs of settlers whose eyes carried the same weariness she often felt. She sat alone in a dark theater, eating popcorn while the flickering light played across her face, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had watched a movie without someone tugging at her sleeve for attention. Each evening, she returned to her motel, body pleasantly tired, spirit lighter than it had been in decades. She would drop onto the bed, stretch across the clean sheets, and think, this is what peace feels like. But by the end of the week, the envelope of cash from her final paycheck was thinning. Motel rates, even at this modest place, were higher than she had expected. Meals at diners and cafes, while comforting, chipped away at her savings. She sat one night on the edge of the bed, flipping through the bills in her wallet, the reality settling over her. Freedom was sweet, but it also came with a price tag. The next morning, Diane decided to walk a little farther from the motel, into a part of town she hadn't explored yet. The streets here were busier, lined with bakeries, thrift shops, and small restaurants. As she passed a cafe with large windows and the smell of fresh coffee spilling into the street, she noticed a paper taped to the glass door. The words were simple, typed in block letters. Help wanted technical worker. She hesitated, rereading the notice. Technical worker sounded formal, almost intimidating. But curiosity nudged her inside. The cafe was warm, filled with the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation. Behind the counter, a young woman in an apron greeted her with a polite smile. "I saw the sign," Diane said, nodding toward the door. "Technical worker." The girl grinned, knowingly. "It's just a fancy way of saying we need someone to help with cleaning. Dishes, tables, maybe sweeping at the end of the day. If you're interested, I can call the manager." Relief washed through her. Work she knew how to do. Work she had been doing for years, without thanks. Only this time, someone would pay her for it. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s appeared, dressed neatly but not stiffly. He introduced himself as Edward Parker, the assistant manager. He explained the details, hours, pay, duties, with a straightforward kindness that surprised her. No condescension, no impatience. Just the facts. "When could you start?" he asked. Diane hesitated only a second. "Today, if you'd like." Edward smiled, extending his hand. "Then welcome aboard." As she shook his hand, Diane felt something shift inside her. The pay would be modest, the task simple, but this was hers. Not an endless obligation demanded by others, but a job she had chosen, a place where her work would be seen and valued. She left the cafe that afternoon with a staff apron folded under her arm and a lightness in her step. For the first time in years, Diane wasn't just surviving, she was building something new, however small. The cafe became Diane's new world, a rhythm she quickly grew to cherish. She slipped into the role easily, apron tied at her waist, hair pulled back, hands moving with practiced efficiency. She carried trays of dirty dishes from tables, wiped crumbs from counters, loaded the dishwasher until its steady hum became a kind of background music. She swept the floors each evening, the scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the air after she locked the mop away. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Each task had a beginning and an end. Unlike at home, where her efforts vanished into the void, unacknowledged and expected to be repeated endlessly. Here, when she cleared a table, the customers smiled and thanked her. When she handed clean dishes back to the line cooks, they nodded with genuine appreciation. Her co-workers treated her as one of their own. Most were younger, college students earning money between classes, a few single mothers working double shifts. They joked with her, included her in their chatter, and never looked down on the tasks she performed. In their eyes, she was part of the team, not a shadow doing invisible labor. And then there was Edward Parker. He wasn't the owner, but he carried himself with calm authority, the kind that didn't need to shout. He noticed things if the dishwasher jammed, if the supplies were running low, and fixed them without drama. He spoke to Diane respectfully, explaining procedures with patience, never once making her feel small. "Good job today, Diane," he said once as she finished wiping down the last row of tables. "You've made things a lot smoother around here." The words were simple, but they struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. At home, praise had disappeared years ago. In fact, the only response to her labor there was silence or worse, complaint. But here, someone saw her, acknowledged her effort. With each passing day, Diane felt something stir inside her that she thought had died long ago, dignity. She wasn't just keeping a roof over ungrateful heads. She wasn't invisible, taken for granted. She was useful, valuable, part of a whole that depended on her. She caught herself smiling more often. Even when her back ached at the end of a shift, it was a different kind of ache, earned, not imposed. She would return to her motel room, set down her shoes, and feel satisfaction instead of resentment. In quiet moments, she reflected on the strange irony of it all. For years, she had scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and folded clothes at home without a word of thanks. Now she was doing almost the same thing in a cafe, yet the difference was night and day. The labor hadn't changed, but the respect had, and that respect was what gave her back a piece of herself. For the first time in years, Diane looked in the mirror and didn't see just a worn-out servant of her family. She saw a woman making her own way, a woman who deserved to be acknowledged. Slowly, carefully, she was beginning to believe she was worth more than the role she had been confined to. One evening, after closing at the cafe, Diane walked back to her motel room with the faint scent of coffee and cleaning solution still clinging to her clothes. She had just kicked off her shoes when her phone, long silent, began to buzz. The screen lit with a name she hadn't seen in weeks, her old friend Marlene. She hesitated before answering, but curiosity won out. "Diane?" Finally, Marlene's voice burst through the line, equal parts relief and urgency. "I've been trying to reach you. Do you have any idea what Robert's been posting?" Diane frowned, sinking onto the bed. "Posting?" "On Facebook, on those community groups. He's painting himself as some poor abandoned husband. Says you ran off, left him and Hannah to starve. People are lining up to comfort him, calling you selfish, ungrateful. He makes it sound like you destroyed that family." The words hit like a punch, though not with the force they might have weeks ago. Diane's hands clenched in her lap. She had expected Robert to sulk, to lash out at home. She hadn't expected him to air their life online for strangers to gawk at. Marlene sighed. "I thought you should know. He's got plenty of sympathy, mostly from women who don't know the first thing about him. And Hannah? She's echoing his posts, commenting right under them." Diane closed her eyes, a dull ache spreading behind her temples. She knew what was coming, but she had to hear it. She opened the messaging app and scrolled through Hannah's page. There it was. Her daughter had updated her status to married. She was joking, of course, a careless act of rebellion. But beneath the joke lay her real allegiance. She had chosen Robert's side, defending him with sharp words, blaming Diane for walking out and leaving us to clean up the mess. The betrayal stung more sharply than the public humiliation. Her own daughter, the child she had carried, nurtured, shielded from storms, turning her into the villain for strangers to judge. She set the phone down, her reflection caught in the darkened window. Once, this would have broken her. Once, she would have begged for forgiveness, pleaded to be understood. But now, after weeks of breathing air not filled with demands, after hearing "thank you" spoken in the cafe more times than in her own home, she felt something different rising inside her. It wasn't despair. It was clarity. There was no place left for her in that house, not because they had shut the door, but because she no longer wanted to step back inside. Robert could cling to his story, Hannah could side with him, but Diane knew the truth. And the truth was that she had carried that family alone for years, and they had never once looked at her as anything more than a pair of hands. She drew a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs like it was a vow. The past was severed. No matter how loud Robert's complaints grew online, no matter how Hannah echoed them, Diane was free from it. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of being without them. She was afraid of ever going back. For several weeks, Diane noticed small surprises waiting for her in the storage room at the cafe. At first, it was a single daisy left in a paper cup, its stem tilted but alive with color. Then came a wrapped piece of chocolate tucked beside the cleaning supplies, a tiny note that simply read, "For your hard work." Another time, it was a small apple polished to a shine, set on the shelf like a token from a secret admirer. Each discovery left her with mixed emotions. It was flattering, of course, to be noticed in such a quiet, thoughtful way. Yet it also unsettled her. The cafe was staffed mostly by young women, college students working part-time, and a few men, the head chef, 2 rotating security guards, and Edward Parker, the assistant manager. Who among them would leave such tokens? She tried to guess. The younger security guard? Too shy, barely spoke beyond polite greetings. The older one? Too gruff, and usually more interested in his cigarette breaks than anything else. The chef was friendly but loud, known for playful banter with everyone. It didn't quite fit. That left Edward, but the thought seemed absurd. He was her manager, composed, professional, older. Why would a man like him leave daisies and chocolates in secret? Still, the mystery followed her through each shift. She caught herself glancing toward the storage room more often, heart quickening at the thought of what she might find there. Every time, there was something waiting, never extravagant, always small, but each one chosen with care. Then, one morning, she arrived earlier than usual. The cafe was quiet, the chairs still stacked on the tables, the smell of fresh coffee just beginning to drift from the kitchen. She headed to the storage room to hang her bag and stopped short. Edward Parker was there, standing with his back to her, setting down a small bouquet of wildflowers in a glass jar on the shelf. For a heartbeat, Diane froze. Then the sound of her footsteps betrayed her. Edward turned, surprise flashing across his face before softening into a faint, almost sheepish smile. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed fragile, like it might shatter with a single word. He lifted a finger to his lips, as though embarrassed to be caught. Then, after a pause, he spoke, his voice gentle. "I owe you an explanation, Diane, but not here, not while we're on the clock." He straightened, his usual composure returning. "Would you allow me to take you for a walk this evening? After your shift. Just a walk. Nothing more." Diane's breath caught. Her first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But something in Edward's manner, his steadiness, his respect, stilled her fear. "All right," she said quietly. 7 o'clock, he replied with a small nod. "In the park, by the fountain." And then he stepped past her, leaving the faint scent of aftershave in the air, the bouquet of wildflowers standing bright against the gray shelves. Diane lingered there, her hand brushing the petals. Her heart was unsteady, caught between disbelief and anticipation. For years she had been invisible, unseen even in her own home. Now someone had noticed her, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a woman. The park was quiet when Diane arrived that evening. The fountain at the center glimmered under the fading light, water spilling gently over stone as the last of the day's heat gave way to a cooler breeze. She had almost turned back twice on her walk there, nerves tightening her chest, but something steadied her, the same quiet courage that had carried her out of Wichita, out of her old life. Edward was already waiting, a small bouquet of daisies in his hand. When he saw her, his expression softened, his usual professional reserve replaced by something warmer, almost vulnerable. "Thank you for coming," he said, offering the flowers. She accepted them hesitantly, their simple beauty making her throat ache. For a moment, they walked in silence, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. Then Edward spoke, his voice low but steady. "I suppose I should start with honesty. My wife passed away 10 years ago. Cancer. Since then, I've raised my children, watched them grow, and now they live their own lives. They call, they visit, but I live mostly alone. The house is quiet. Too quiet." Diane listened, the weight of his words pressing gently against her heart. "I wasn't looking for anyone," Edward continued. "But when you walked into the cafe that first day, I noticed something in you. The way you accepted the work, without complaint, without shame. You carried yourself with a dignity most people overlook. You were kind to everyone, even when you were exhausted. And slowly, I found myself leaving those little tokens, hoping to brighten your day the way you unknowingly brightened mine." He paused, turning to face her beneath the shade of an old oak tree. His eyes, usually calm and professional, now held a naked sincerity. "Diane, I know this might sound sudden, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you. I've seen your strength, your resilience, and your kindness, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" The words struck her like a gust of wind, leaving her breathless. Marry him? They had barely spoken outside of work. Yet, as she stood there, daisies trembling in her hands, she realized she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Her mind flickered back to Robert's cold silences, Hannah's disdain, the endless cycle of invisible labor. Then back to this man, standing before her with open hands, offering not demands but devotion. A tear slipped down her cheek. "Yes," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "Yes, I will." Edward's smile widened, relief and joy mingling in his expression. He reached for her hand, and together they continued their walk, the evening light wrapping them in a glow that felt like promise. In the weeks that followed, Diane filed for divorce. The process was straightforward. Robert, still busy nursing his grievances online, barely contested it. Hannah visited once, their conversation clipped and tense, but Diane no longer sought approval. Her future no longer hinged on a daughter who could not yet understand. By the time the papers were finalized, Diane had already moved into Edward's home. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with warmth. Books stacked on end tables, photographs of his children, and soon enough, touches of her own life woven in. When they stood before a small group of friends and coworkers and exchanged vows, Diane felt as if she were finally stepping into the life she deserved. Epilogue. 3 years later, the cafe still bustled, though Diane no longer worked there. Instead, she managed the books for Edward's small chain of cafes, her skills and patience serving her well in this new chapter. Each morning, Edward left a small gift by her bedside, a flower, a note, sometimes just a piece of fruit. The tradition had never stopped. It had simply moved from the storage room to the intimacy of their shared home. Neighbors and friends often remarked on the couple, how tenderly they treated each other, how their love seemed both steady and luminous. People called it a late romance, but to Diane it felt timeless, proof that even after years of loneliness, happiness could still arrive, soft and unassuming, like daisies left quietly on a shelf. And when she looked at Edward across the breakfast table, his eyes bright with affection, she knew that her story had not ended in despair. It had begun anew, in love discovered when she least expected it. The Texas night outside my dorm room felt heavy, almost sticky, as if the summer heat refused to let go even after midnight. The ceiling fan turned in slow, lazy circles above my head, doing little more than stirring the warm air. It was 2:45 a.m., and the only light in the room came from the desk lamp, its yellow glow pooling over my open neurology textbook, highlighting the pages crammed with underlined terms and scribbled notes. My eyes burned from hours of reading, and the words in front of me started to blur together, the long, complicated phrases twisting into something unrecognizable. Hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, multifocal atherosclerosis, they no longer felt like medical terms, but like wild creatures refusing to be tamed. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, the exhaustion making my temples throb. The cicadas outside hummed in a steady rhythm, their song merging with the faint scent of jasmine drifting through the open window. For a moment, I thought about just letting my head fall onto the desk and giving in to the weight pulling me down. But then, without warning, an image surfaced in my mind, my father's old doctor's bag. It was made of worn brown leather, soft in some places, cracked in others, with a brass clasp dulled by time. I could still hear my father's voice the day he first showed it to me, the sunlight streaming through the blinds of his small clinic in our hometown. "This bag has been with our family for almost 100 years, Liv," he'd said, his tone warm, almost reverent. "Your great-grandfather carried it through the war. Your grandfather took it into rural towns where hospitals didn't exist. And now it's my turn. One day, maybe it will be yours. I had traced the initials stamped into the leather, BC for Benjamin Carter, and asked him if it was heavy. He smiled, that tired, gentle smile of his. It's not the bag that's heavy, sweetheart. It's the responsibility it carries. These hands, he took my small ones in his, strong and warm. They're meant to heal. That's both a gift and a burden, and it's one you'll have to carry with care. The memory faded, leaving behind the same bittersweet ache it always did. My father's presence was never constant, but when he was there, the world felt brighter. He'd sweep into the house with expensive gifts I didn't know we couldn't afford, telling stories of the patients he'd saved, of long nights in Houston's busiest hospitals, of the people who thanked him with tears in their eyes. And my mother, for those brief days, she seemed lighter too, her shoulders straighter, her laugh more frequent, as if the years of fatigue had been lifted, if only temporarily. It was the same laugh she must have had when she first fell in love with him, back when she was a young nurse, and he was the charismatic surgeon everyone admired. I took a slow breath and glanced at the clock again. 2:51 a.m. The exam loomed closer with every passing minute, but the thought of my father's words seemed to anchor me in place. I reached for my pen, the plastic cool against my fingers, and forced my eyes back to the textbook. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was I. It happened in the spring, on one of those rare Houston days when the air felt almost cool and the sky stretched in a perfect, unbroken blue. I was still in high school, sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of homework in front of me, when the phone rang. My mother answered, her voice light at first, then quieter, and then completely still. I didn't know what the words were at first. I just knew the way her hand clutched the counter, how her knuckles turned white. When she hung up, she didn't look at me right away. "It's your father," she finally said. He collapsed. A heart attack. He had been just 6 blocks from the hospital where he'd saved countless lives over the years. But this time, no one had been there fast enough. The cruelest irony, the man who had brought strangers back from the brink didn't get the same chance. The funeral was held in a stately old church in the city. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the pews. I expected to see colleagues, patients, maybe distant relatives. What I didn't expect was the tall, elegant woman standing near the front, dressed in black, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a young man. Beside him stood a girl my age, her gaze sharp yet curious. "This is Matthew," my mother murmured when she caught me staring. "And Hannah." She hesitated, her voice flattening. "Your brother and sister." The words felt foreign, awkward in my ears, like they didn't belong to me. My brother and sister, from a life I knew nothing about. After the service, I couldn't stop looking at them. The way Matthew carried himself with a quiet confidence, the way Hannah's eyes flicked over me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I didn't know whether I hated them, envied them, or just wanted to vanish before they spoke to me. Back home, I finally asked my mother the question burning in my chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" She met my eyes with the kind of weariness that comes from years of holding things in. "What would it have changed, Liv? You loved him. He loved you. The rest, those were adult problems. But it did change something. Everything, really." In the weeks that followed, I noticed the shifts in our world, subtle at first, then undeniable. Mom started picking up extra shifts at the small clinic where she worked. Grocery lists got shorter. New clothes were quietly replaced by repairs and alterations. One night, as she patched a worn hem on my skirt for the 3rd time, I finally asked, "We're having money problems, aren't we?" She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not problems, just adjustments. Your father helped us before. We'll just have to learn to manage without it." It was then I realized those extravagant gifts he used to bring weren't just gestures of love. They had been holding up our lives in ways I hadn't seen. And now that safety net was gone. That was the night I decided I couldn't just be a passenger in my own life anymore. I was 16 when I made my first truly adult decision. There was no dramatic speech, no teary confrontation, just a quiet shift in the way I moved through the world. I stopped taking piano lessons. I told my art instructor I wouldn't be coming back. I turned down every invitation from friends to grab burgers after school or catch a Friday night movie. At first, they laughed it off. "What? Are you grounded or something?" my best friend at the time, Melissa, asked when I skipped yet another outing. I just shook my head and said, "I've got other things to do." But the truth sat heavier than I let on. By then, I had $20 to last me the week, and I had to stretch for gas, snacks, and anything else that came up. One by one, the invitations stopped. My phone buzzed less. By the end of junior year, it was mostly just me, my textbooks, and my mother coming home from the clinic looking like she was holding herself together by sheer will. But in the middle of all that, one thing stayed clear. I was going to medical school. Not just any school. The University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. It was the same place my father used to talk about, his voice tinged with pride and nostalgia. UTMB makes real doctors, he'd say. The kind who can hold their own in any ER in the country. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table eating leftover chili, I told my mother I planned to apply there. She set her spoon down and looked at me like I'd just announced I was climbing Everest without oxygen. "You know how competitive it is, Liv? 15 applicants for every spot, and that's just for the in-state program." "I know," I said, keeping my tone even. "That's why I'm going to work twice as hard." Her eyes softened, but there was something else there too, something like fear. It's not about how hard you work. It's the system. People like us, we either work twice as hard for half as much, or we accept what we're given. "Then I'll take the first option," I said, "and I won't quit." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that made every sound in the house suddenly louder. The hum of the fridge, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint creak of the chair as she leaned back. I don't think she understood then, not fully, that this wasn't just a phase or a burst of teenage stubbornness. This was the only path I saw forward. That night, I spread my books out across the living room floor, cross-legged on the carpet. I made a schedule that would carry me all the way through senior year and into my first college entrance exams. Looking back, I don't know if it was determination or desperation, maybe a little of both. But either way, I had set my course. And nothing, not money, not exhaustion, not the weight of my father's shadow, was going to knock me off it. The envelope arrived 2 days before my high school graduation. It was plain white, the kind you'd buy in a pack of 50, but my name was written in careful, deliberate handwriting that I didn't recognize. The return address read, Matthew Carter Austin, Texas. I stood in the kitchen, the afternoon light slanting across the counter, turning the envelope over in my hands. For a long time, I didn't open it. We'd barely spoken at the funeral. He'd been polite, distant, like a stranger you meet in passing, but his eyes had carried something unreadable. When I finally tore the flap open, 2 things slid out, a folded letter and a small USB drive. "Liv," the letter began, "I know this might seem sudden after years of silence. Our connection is complicated. We share blood, but not a life. Dad left behind a trail of unfinished conversations, and I think some of them were meant for you. A few weeks ago, I was cleaning out his study here in Austin and found a folder with your name on it. Inside were medical case notes, journal entries, and articles he'd clipped over the years. I scanned them all for you. They're on the drive. There's also a letter of recommendation addressed to someone named Dr. Alan Brooks at the University of Texas Medical Branch. I think you should see it for yourself. If you ever want to talk, my number is on the back of this page." I set the letter aside and plugged the drive into my laptop. It was like stepping into an archive built just for me. Pages of anatomy sketches, handwritten notes in my father's sharp, slanted script, diagrams for medical journals, even practice exam questions. I found myself smiling despite the lump forming in my throat. And then I opened the letter addressed to Dr. Brooks. My father's words hit me like a pulse through the chest. Trust me on this one, Alan. The girl's a real Carter. She's got the same blood that carried 3 generations of us through battlefields, epidemics, and operating rooms. She's determined, sharp, and she will make you proud if you give her the chance. I read those lines again and again until the letters blurred. For 3 years, I'd carried the weight of not knowing whether he'd truly believed in me, or if all my ambition was just my way of filling the space he'd left behind. But here it was in his own hand, proof that he'd seen me, even if he hadn't always been there. That night, I sat at my desk long after the sun had gone down. The USB drive still plugged in, its little light blinking like it was keeping watch. I traced my fingers over the paper, over my father's name at the bottom of the page, and felt something I hadn't in a long time, like maybe I wasn't as alone in this as I thought. 3 days after graduation, I boarded a Greyhound bound for Galveston with a second-hand duffel bag, my father's letter carefully folded in my wallet, and just over $200 to my name. The bus ride took a little over an hour, but the air changed the moment we rolled into the island, thicker, salter, tinged with the faint smell of diesel from the fishing boats down at the pier. I had never been to Galveston before. It wasn't the sprawling, steel-and-glass skyline of Houston. Here, the streets felt slower, more weathered, the buildings bleached by sun and sea air. I stepped off the bus into the kind of heat that seemed to press against your skin, like a physical weight, and told myself I could handle anything. My first stop was the University of Texas Medical Branch. The main building loomed ahead, all brick and white columns, a blend of history and authority. I tightened my grip on my bag and went in search of Dr. Alan Brooks. It didn't take long to find someone who looked like he belonged there, a tall man in a pressed shirt, silver hair neatly combed back, holding a stack of papers under one arm. I approached him, heart pounding. "Excuse me," I began. "Do you happen to know Dr. Alan Brooks?" He turned, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm Dr. Brooks. How can I help you?" Relief and nerves collided in my chest. "My name is Olivia Carter. My father was Benjamin Carter. He left me a letter of recommendation for you." The name seemed to land somewhere in his memory, but his expression stayed guarded. Benjamin Carter. Yes, I remember him. A good surgeon. He glanced toward the hallway. "Why don't we talk in my office?" The walk there felt longer than it was. I sat across from his desk while he read the letter, his eyes scanning quickly, then more slowly. When he looked up, there was no pity in his face, only professionalism. "You have decent grades," he said. "Good, but you need to understand, UTMB takes the best of the best, and getting in is only half the battle. The rest, well, that's on you." "I'm ready to work for it," I said, leaning forward without realizing it. He nodded once, as if weighing my words. "I'm not in the business of handing out favors. Benjamin was a friend, but medicine is serious work. You'll have to prove yourself. If you do, then maybe we'll talk again." When I left his office, the sun was beginning to sink, turning the Gulf waters a deep orange. I should have felt discouraged, but I didn't. For the first time in months, someone had spoken to me without softening their words, without pretending the path ahead would be anything but brutal. And that somehow felt like respect. By the time exam day came, I'd been living out of a cheap room I'd rented week to week near the seawall, the kind where the air conditioner rattled louder than it cooled. Every spare moment had gone into studying. Flashcards spread across the bed, diagrams taped to the wall, my father's notes open beside me like a lifeline. I told myself over and over, if I just worked hard enough, I could make it. The written test felt like walking a tightrope over open water. Questions came in rapid fire, but the hours of drilling and memorization paid off. Answers rose to the surface of my mind before doubt could drag them under. By the time I handed in my paper, I was exhausted but steady. I'd done everything I could. The next morning, I joined the crowd huddled around the bulletin board outside the admissions office. Names were posted in neat, alphabetical order, the kind of list you could scan in seconds, unless yours wasn't there. I looked once, twice. My eyes kept searching, refusing to believe it. Finally, I found a staff member and asked if there had been a mistake. She shook her head gently. You missed the cutoff by 1 point. 1 point. 1. It was such a small number that it didn't even seem real, but the space between me and that passing score might as well have been the Gulf of Mexico. I wandered to a payphone on the corner, the Texas sun beating down on me until sweat trickled down my back. My cell was dead, and I hadn't thought to bring the charger. When my mother picked up, I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't make it, I said. There's a pause, just long enough for me to think the line had gone dead. Then she said, maybe that's for the best, Liv. The words hit harder than I expected. For the best. Her voice was careful, almost too calm. It would have been expensive, stressful. You could apply to the teaching college back home. Live here. It wouldn't be such a strain. I knew she meant well, but what I heard was relief, that she wouldn't have to worry about sending money, about her daughter living hours away in a city that could swallow her whole. No, I said, sharper than I meant to. I'm staying in Galveston. I'll start at the community college's nursing program and transfer later. I'm still going to be a doctor. When I hung up, I stood there for a long time, staring at the faded phone booth wall, my reflection faint in the scratched glass. The dream hadn't changed, only the route had, and if that meant taking the long way around, then so be it. The dorm room they assigned me at Galveston Community College was on the 3rd floor of an aging brick building that smelled faintly of salt and mildew. The paint on the walls had begun to bubble in spots, and the small window rattled every time the coastal wind pushed against it. My new roommate, Kayla Johnson, was a stocky girl from a farming town out near the Panhandle. She spoke little, kept her hair in a tight braid, and always seemed to have something to chew. Homemade cornbread, dried jerky, sometimes just sunflower seeds. For the first week, we moved around each other in silence. Then one night, while I sat on my bed trying to trick my stomach into ignoring its own emptiness with nothing but hot water and a spoonful of sugar, she slid a plate across the desk toward me without looking up from her notes. It held a thick slice of cornbread and a jar of peach preserves. Eat, she said simply. It's painful watching you live on tea and crackers. From then on, we had an unspoken trade. She shared the food her mother mailed in massive care packages, and I helped her with her coursework, explaining anatomy charts and checking her quizzes. It wasn't friendship exactly, more like survival in a shared trench. Outside that room, it was different. My classmates were mostly from well-off families, fresh manicures, the latest iPhones, weekend trips to Houston for shopping or concerts. They'd glance at my thrift store backpack, the sweater with repaired elbows, and look right past me. One afternoon, as I walked into the lab, the class rep, a bleach blonde with perfect lashes, called across the room. Hey, Ragged Olivia, you left your ID in the dean's office. Might want to pick it up before they think you stole it. The way she said it wasn't sharp, wasn't meant to start a fight. It was casual, like she'd just used my job title, and somehow that made it sting worse. By winter, the island wind had turned damp and cold. My coat was the same one I'd worn in high school, its lining thinned from years of wear, and my shoes had developed a slit along the sole that let in water when I walked across the puddled streets. Every morning, the chill settled deep in my bones before I even made it to the first lecture. Then came the notice for a holiday fundraiser, $500 per student to buy gifts for the faculty. For most of them, it was nothing a week's allowance. For me, it was the last straw. That night, I pulled the tin box from under my bed, the one that held my just-in-case fund. Inside was $1,000 scraped together over months, along with the only photo I had of my father holding me as a little girl. I held the picture for a long time, tracing the lines of his smile. My throat tightened as I whispered, I can't keep doing this. I was ready to call my mother the next morning, ask for enough bus fare to come home, and let this whole dream go. But that knock on the door changed everything. When I opened the door that night, I expected a dorm advisor or maybe Kayla with another jar of preserves. Instead, a slim girl with cropped dark hair and sharp brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses stood there, a rolling suitcase by her side. "Hey," she said brightly. "I'm Jasmine Lopez. Just transferred from the nursing program up in San Antonio. They told me I'm your new roommate. Mind if I come in?" I stepped aside, still caught off guard. She scanned the room in one sweeping glance and smiled. "Cozy. Could use a little work, but I've seen worse." Then she glanced at my desk. "Is there anywhere around here to grab a bite? I'm starving." "There's a communal kitchen down the hall," I said, "but I've got some cornbread if you want." She grinned. "Even better. I'll go grab something from the store tomorrow and we'll make it a real meal." It was the first time in months I'd sat across from someone new and actually talked. We shared cornbread and tea, swapping bits of our lives in half-joking tones. Her childhood in Laredo, my father's old doctor's bag, the way Galveston air seemed to stick to your skin no matter how many showers you took. 2 weeks later, Jasmine convinced me to join her for morning runs. "It's not about speed," she said. "It's about clearing your head before the day chews you up." That morning, the sky over the Gulf was streaked in pale pink and gray. We jogged along the quiet canal, the water dark and still, broken only by the ripple of a passing pelican. Then Jasmine slowed, squinting ahead. "What's that?" "A bird stuck in the reeds." I followed her gaze and froze. It wasn't a bird. It was a man. He lay half in the water, half on the muddy bank, his clothes soaked through, his face turned toward the reeds. "Probably just drunk," Jasmine muttered. "We should call the cops." "What if it's not that?" I said, already moving. "What if he's in trouble?" The slope was slick from last night's rain. My sneakers slid, and I nearly lost my balance before hitting the bank hard enough to send cold mud splattering up my legs. But when I reached him and touched his shoulder, he stirred, weakly, his eyes glassy, his mouth opening around sounds that didn't form words. And then it clicked. The uneven facial muscles, the slurred, broken syllables, the vacant, struggling focus. "Jasmine." I called up. "Call 911 right now. Tell them it's a stroke. We've got minutes." She hesitated just long enough for me to shout again, then pulled out her phone. I knelt beside him, forcing my voice into something steady. "Sir, can you squeeze my hand?" His left hand twitched weakly against mine. The right stayed limp. "Okay, you're going to be all right. Help is coming. You're not alone." The wind off the water bit through my wet clothes, but I didn't move. I just stayed there, holding on, counting my own breaths as sirens began to wail somewhere far off and growing closer. The paramedics arrived in a rush of bright lights and purposeful movements, their boots splashing through the mud as they lowered the stretcher down the slope. One of them, a tall man with weathered hands, knelt to check the patient's vitals. "Good call," he said to me after a quick exam. "If you hadn't spotted this when you did, the outcome could have been very different." They lifted him gently, securing straps and 4 lines before carrying him up to the waiting ambulance. Jasmine reappeared at my side, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "You're shaking," she said quietly. "I'm fine, elite." But the truth was the adrenaline had my whole body humming, every nerve on edge. 10 minutes later, one of the medics waved us toward a dark SUV idling near the curb. "Mr. Davidson would like to speak with you when you have a moment," he said. Inside the vehicle, the air was cool and smelled faintly of leather. The man from the canal, now propped up against pillows, an oxygen line under his nose, looked at me with one steady eye. The other side of his face still bore the slackness of the stroke, but there was warmth in his gaze. "Thank you," he said slowly, each word a careful effort. "You saved my life." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. I just did what anyone would do. Not anyone, he murmured. Then, after a pause, my name is Charles Davidson. I own a construction firm in Houston. Jasmine tells me you're studying nursing, but aiming for medical school. I glanced at Jasmine. She gave a small shrug, as if to say she hadn't meant to spill my whole story. Mr. Davidson's expression hardened with resolve. Let me pay for it. Tuition, books, housing, all of it. You've already proven you have what it takes. The words seemed to hang in the air, too heavy to process all at once. I can't accept that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's too much. He gave a faint, crooked smile. It's not charity. It's an investment in someone who knows what it means to act when it matters. Please, Olivia, let me do this. I thought of my father's letter, of my mother working herself thin, of every closed door I'd tried to push through on my own. And for the first time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to fight every battle alone. That night, I called my mother from the dorm's common room. I told her everything, my words tumbling over each other in a rush. When I finally stopped, there was a long silence on the line. Mom. Her voice trembled when it came. It's a miracle, Liv, and you've earned it. I'm proud of you. The next morning, there was a letter waiting in my campus mailbox. The return address read, Matthew Carter. I heard about what happened. It began. Dad would be proud of you. I know we've never been close, but maybe it's time we tried. You're a Carter in every sense that matters. That evening, I walked down to the canal. The water was calm, reflecting the deep orange of the Texas sunset. I sat there for a long time, thinking about the strange paths that had brought me here, the losses, the betrayals, the near misses, and how each one had shaped the person I was becoming. My father's dream had started me on this road, but from now on it was mine, step by step, day by day, with hands made to heal,